I am Eileen Formentera,
And I am Janelle Ambuelarios.
and today we will be tackling about
Jose Rizal's second trip abroad.
on Jose Rizal's first homecoming. He was affectionately welcomed by his family with tears of joy in their eyes. Nonetheless, Rizal wasn't able to stay longer. Haunted by powerful enemies, General Emilio Terrero advised Rizal to leave the country for the second time around in order to escape the fury of the friars. Because the longer he stays in the country, the more it jeopardizes the safety of his family. And it would be better if he fight his enemies and serve his poor country by writing in foreign countries. Thus, his 6-month stay came to an end on February 3, 1888, when he left Manila for Hong Kong on board the Zephyr. In his letter to his best friend, Professor Blumentritt, Rizal revealed that I am returning to Europe by way of Japan and the United States. We should see each other again. I have so much to tell you. At last, I can write freely and express my thoughts without fear of censorship. On February 8, 1888, Rizal arrived in Hong Kong and stayed at Victoria Hotel, where he met Jose Maria Basa, one of the Filipino residents in Hong Kong, who also became Rizal's companion. He was also introduced to some leading Spaniards, and one of them was Jose Sainz de Veranda, a Spaniard who was a former secretary of Governor General Terrero. It was believed that he was commissioned by the Spanish authorities to spy on him. On February 16, 1888, Rizal, on his letter to Blumentritt, he described Hong Kong as a small but very clean city. And 2 days after, Rizal, together with Jose Maria Basa and Veranda, took to Macau, boarded the ferry steamer Kiukiang. His reason was to see the Portuguese colony, which is Macau, and to visit Don Juan Francisco Licarus, in whose house they were guests. Actually, Don Juan, Basa, and other Filipinos of Hong Kong are partisans and promoters of the book Nolim ni Tangere. While in Macau, Rizal visited cathedral and churches, pagodas, temples, shrines, theaters, botanical garden, and bazaars. And he also studied Chinese way of life, wherein in his diary, he briefly wrote his experiences and observations as follows. The first one is the Chinese New Year. The celebration of the Chinese New Year was very noisy because of the continuous explosions of firecrackers on the streets, and that rich Chinese had more firecrackers to explode. The second one is the Chinese theaters. The Chinese theaters are usually noisy and full of life because of the different percussion instruments used by the participants and the noisy created by the audience. The next is the Marathon Laureate Party, which was the longest meal Rizal had in his life. The fourth is the richest religious order in Hong Kong, which is the Dominican order that engaged actively in business and had millions of dollars deposited in various banks. And the last one is the cemeteries in Hong Kong, wherein the Protestants were the most beautiful, the Catholics were the most pompous, elaborate, and expensive, and the simplest was of that Muslim. On February 20, they returned back to Hong Kong on board again the ferry steamer Kiukiang. And after 2 days, Rizal left Hong Kong on board the Oceanic, an American steamer where his next destination is the land of cherry blossom, which is Japan. It took him 6 days to finally arrive in Yokohama, Japan, and stayed at Grand Hotel. The following day, he proceeded to Tokyo and stayed there for a few days. He lived in the Spanish legation, which was the official headquarters of Spanish diplomat in Japan, for about a month. It was because of the invitation of Juan Perez Caballero. Juan Perez Caballero is the secretary of the Spanish legation. Though Rizal knew it was a plot to monitor him, he still accepted Caballero's offer, as he could economize his living expenses and that he had nothing to hide from the prying eyes of the Spanish authorities. During his stay, he visited provinces and learned Japanese and even dedicated himself to study Japanese theater, art, and language. In his letter to Blumentritt, he said, Tokyo is bigger than Paris. The vast walls were built in cyclopean character, and the streets are wide and well lighted. And as a keen observer, these were the things he impressed most in Japan. The beauty of the country, the Japanese great fondness for garden steaming, Japanese women wearing kimono, where he described simple but gracious, hospitality of the Japanese people, the gift giving, the politeness through bowing, few beggars on the streets, few thieves, very clean and multifunctional houses, and lastly, Japanese are happy and industrious people. But in spite of all the beautiful and pleasant experiences he had, he was quite disgusted to see men pulling rickshaws like horses. So here is the picture. In his brief stay in Japan, Rizal got acquainted with a Japanese beautiful lady who was Siko Osoi, and her friends called her Osei-san. He met her on his stay in the Spanish legation in Tokyo, and as a man of honor and principles, Rizal introduced himself to the young lady, and the latter was impressed with the charisma of the former. It was Osei-san who accompanied Rizal to some of the beautiful and romantic places in Tokyo. With that, Rizal's love and affection for her became intense, and that it made him wrote in his diary the following. Your image lives in my memory, and undoubtedly, I am always thinking of you. Your name lives in the sight of my lips. Your image accompanies and animates all my thoughts. Though leaving Japan gave much sadness to Jose Rizal, on April 13, he left Yokohama on board the steamer Belgique going to the United States. On his voyage, Rizal met and befriended Ticho Suhiro, a Japanese who was also a prolific writer like Rizal. However, Ticho only knew Japanese language, so Rizal became his interpreter. Ticho was very much impressed with Rizal, wrote in his diary, and described him as an open-hearted man.
April 28, 1888. The ship Rizal on board Belgique docked on San Francisco port, but because of the strict quarantine, Rizal and the other first-class passengers were not allowed to disembark until May 4. Reason: the steamer was carrying 800 Chinese. San Francisco were having the election that time.
On the contrary, 700 bundles of valuable Chinese silk were landed without fumigation.
On one occasion, Rizal was asked by Jose Alejandro about his impression of America, where Rizal answered,
America is the land par excellence of freedom, but only for the whites. And on May 13, 1888, Rizal left New York on board the City of Rome, the second largest ship in the world during Rizal's time. On May 25, 1888, Jose Rizal arrived in London. He chose London for three reasons: to improve his knowledge in English language, to study and annotate Dr. Morga's book Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas, and it was a safe place for him to carry on his fight against the Spanish tyranny. So this is Antonio de Morga, and the only copy of Morga's history in the British Museum used by Rizal. Due to Jose Rizal's amazing linguistic accomplishments, Dr. Reinhold Ross, an eminent Sanskrit scholar and a librarian of the India Office, and the greatest linguist in that century, called Jose Rizal Una Perla de Hombre, or A Pearl of a Man.
While in London, Rizal received from Calamba both good and bad news. The bad news were mostly injustice committed by the Spanish and authorities by the Filipinos. Bad news from Calamba: persecution of Filipino patriot who signed anti-friar petition of 1888. Persecution of the Calamba tenants. Furious attack on Rizal Spanish Cortes and newspapers. Manuel T. Hidalgo was exiled to Bohol without due process of law. Lawrence Viado was arrested and jailed because copies of Noli Me Tangere found in his house. Good news from Calamba: Rev. Vicente Garcia defense of Noli Me Tangere against the attacks of the friars. On January 7, 1891, Rizal wrote to Father Garcia expressing her personal gratitude.
Rizal learned that the Filipinos in Barcelona were planning to establish a patriotic society, the Asociación La Solidaridad, Solidaridad Association. It was inaugurated on December 31, 1888, wherein Gallicano Apacible as president, Garciano Lopez Haina as vice president, and Jose Rizal was chosen as the honorary president.
February 15, 1889, Graciano Lopez Haina founded a patriotic newspaper in La Solidaridad in Barcelona, where Marcelo H. del Pilar became of the editor. Objectives: to establish reform to our country, to show the unfortunate condition in the Philippines committed by Spaniards, to promote free and progressive ideas, to implement the patriotic vision of the Filipinos. Rizal articles in La Solidaridad. First article he wrote: Los Agriculturos Filipinos. Defense of Fray Rodriguez and attack on his Noli. La Vision del Fray Rodriguez. Upon the request of Marcela H. del Pilar. Letter of the Young Woman of Malolos. La Solidaridad newspapers. Jose Rizal's articles were very much the most important material the paper published under the pen names of Demas Alang and Laung Laan. Dr. Reinhold Rose requested Rizal to contribute some articles to the journal, were the Rose the editor. These articles were a specimen of Tagalog folklore and two Eastern fables.
Before he left London, he finished 4 sculptural works in terracotta: The Prometheus Bound, The Triumph of Death over Life, The Triumph of Science over Death, and a composite carving of the heads of the Becket sisters. It was given as a gift to the Becket family. The Triumph of Death over Life and the Triumph of Science over Death was given to his best friend, Bloomingtreet.
March 19, 1889. Rizal left London. He was sad and he crossed the English Channel, for he had many beautiful memories in London.
On March of 1889, Rizal arrived in Paris. The approaching Universal Exposition attracted thousands of tourists, making it difficult for Rizal to find living quarters.
Valentin Ventura. Rizal temporarily stayed at his house at 45 Rue Manbogue and polished an annotated edition of Morga's book. Rizal was frequent visitor at the home of Pardo de Tavera. On Sundays, Rizal feasts at Juan Luna House. Luna is opponent.
One afternoon, the Tagalog story of the monkey and the tortoise was hastily sketched as a joke to fill the remaining pages of Mrs. Luna's album, in which she had been insisting Rizal must write before all its space was used up. Like any Filipino tourist in a foreign land, Rizal was fascinated by the Universal Exposition. Its opening on May 6, 1889 was highlighted by showing to the world its greatest attraction, which is the Eiffel Tower. To bring together all the Filipinos who watched and joined the exposition, and to enjoy their journey in the city during the duration of the exposition, Rizal organized a social group which was named Kidlat Club and was founded on March 19, 1889. Rizal, together with the Filipinos in Hong Kong, witnessed the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1890, which presents the skill and the life of the American Indians, and became the inspiration of Rizal in naming his one societal club. the Indios Bravos, which replaced the Kidlat Club, and its purpose was to stand and not to be ashamed of being called Indios. Jose Rizal's outstanding achievement in Paris was the publication of his annotated edition of Morga's book, which he wrote in British Museum. The prologue was written by Professor Ferdinand Blumentritt, and the dedication was by Rizal. In this historical work, Rizal proved that the Filipinos were already civilized before the advent of Spain. They had clothes, governments, laws, writing, literature, religion, arts, sciences, and commerce with neighboring Asian nations. Thus, Rizal blasted the historical heresies of the Spanish writers who claimed that the early Filipinos were savages and were low mentality. Now, while in Paris, Rizal planned to establish a modern college in Hong Kong, where Mr. Mariano Conanan from Mexico, Pampanga, promised to help Rizal raise 40,000 pesos as initial capital for the college. Unfortunately, the project did not materialize. In the fall of 1889, Jose wrote again another satirical work. It is a reply to Father Salvador Font, who was against and the mastermind of banning his novel Noli Me Tangere. And on January 28, 1890, Rizal left Paris for Brazil's capital of Belgium. His reasons that was the cost of living in Paris was very high because of the Universal Exposition. The gay social life of the city hampered his literary works, especially the writing of his second novel, El Filibusterismo. Jose Albert accompanied Jose Rizal to move to Brazils. They lived in a modest boarding house. Later, Albert left the city and was replaced by Jose Alejandro, an engineering student. They stayed in a boarding house at 38 Row Philippe Champagne, run by two Jacobi sisters, Suzanne and Marie, where Rizal spent his time writing his second novel, El Filibusterismo. While in Brazil, he wrote articles for La Solidaridad and letters for his family and friends. He also spent his remaining time doing gymnastics, target practice, and fencing at the armory. Aside from that, Rizal was the first to advocate the Filipinization of its orthography. The Tagalog letters K and W should be used instead of the Spanish letters C and O. For example, the word salakot the C was replaced by K, and the word araw, where the O was replaced by W. When on September 1886, while in Leipzig, he adopted the Filipinized Tagalog in his translations of Schiller's Wilhelm Tell and Andersen's Fairy Tale. Rizal received news from Juan Luna and Valentin Ventura that the Filipinos in Madrid were destroying the good name of their nation by gambling too much. Thus, Rizal wrote to Marcelo H. del Pilar to remind the Filipinos in Madrid that they went to Europe to work for their fatherland's freedom and not to gamble. The gambling people in Madrid were very angry when they learned of Rizal's moralizing. They scornfully called him Papa or Pope instead of Pepe. Letters from Calamba worried Rizal because they were mostly bad news. The bad news were the Calamba agrarian trouble was getting worse. The management of the Dominican Hacienda continually raised the land rents. The Dominican order filed a suit in court to dispossess the Rizal family of their lands in Calamba. The tenants were persecuted. Pasiano, Antonio Lopez, and Silvestre Ubaldo were deported to Mindoro, and Manuel T. Hidalgo was banished to Bohol for the second time. In his moment of despair, Rizal had bad dreams during the night in Brazil. He was restless because he was always thinking of how his unhappy family in Calamba doing. Although he was not superstitious, He had he feared he would not live long. He was not afraid to die, but wanted to finish his second novel before he dies. In his letter to Del Pilar, it stated, "In my childhood, I had a strange belief that I would not reach 30 years of age. I am preparing myself for death. Laong Laan, ever ready, is my true name." With the sufferings of his family, Rizal planned to go home. He could not stay in Brazil writing a book while his parents, relatives, and friends in Philippines were persecuted. Rizal's friends warned him of the danger that awaited him at home. But something happened that made Rizal to change his plan. In returning to the Philippines, when he received a letter from Pasiano that they lost the case against the Dominicans in Manila. Nonetheless, they appealed it to the Supreme Court. And on June 20, 1890, Rizal wrote to Del Pilar, getting him as their counsel and notified that he will be going to Madrid to supervise the handling of their case. Though worried of his family in Calamba, he was able to write a poem. Even it lacks exquisiteness and polish, it has a passionate feeling. It was entitled Ame, or To My Muse. Early in August 1890, Rizal arrived in Madrid. He tried all the legal and possible means to seek justice for his family and the Calamba tenants. Disappointment after disappointments piled on him, until the cross he bore seemed too heavy to carry. With resilient character, he survived all the challenges. The following are the disappointments he had in Madrid. The first one is the failure to get justice for his family. The death of Panganiban, his aborted duel with Antonio Luna and Wenceslao Retana, the infidelity of Leonor Rivera, and the Rizal and Del Pilar rivalry and abdication of the leadership in La Solidaridad. To seek solace for his disappointments in Madrid, Rizal took a vacation in Biarritz. It is a resort city known for its fabulous French Riviera, and the one-month vacation in Biarritz worked wonders for Jose Rizal. He wrote and finished the last chapter of his second novel, El Filibusterismo, and even retired from the propaganda movement. Aside from that, he also ceased writing articles for La Solidaridad. In a letter to Deodato Arellano in Manila, reveals what was Rizal's mind at the time. He said, "I think it is necessary for me to retire and set up my office and earn a living. My chosen point is either the Philippines, Hong Kong, or Japan, for Europe seems like a banishment to me." And that ends our report. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that you've learned something.